What would happen if a man who walked in daily reverence of God lost everything in a single breath? Picture that question like a stone thrown into still water. In a land called Uz, the morning light was thin and sharp. The sun slanted across clay roofs. The smell of baking barley rose from a courtyard, and the lowing of distant flocks threaded the air. The man at the center of our story had a name that echoed in market lanes and temple courts. He was known as upright, a man of integrity, feared God in the way a tree fears wind yet stands firm. His household was full of children whose laughter filled rooms. His storehouses smelled of fresh grain and cedar, and his flocks moved across the hills like dark waves. But more than that abundance, he was remembered for a daily habit that revealed his heart. Each dawn, while the sky still tasted of cool iron and the wool of his sheep was damp with dew, he would prepare a holocaust for his children and offer intercession, laying open his fear that some secret transgression might lurk in a young heart. No one imagined that beyond human sight, in courts where the Altissimo sat and beings came to present themselves, his name would be spoken and an accuser would take note. A test was being set, and what followed would teach things about suffering, sovereignty, and the ways of God that words alone cannot hold. Stay with me to see how a life of devotion can be tried, and what insight every believer can carry home. He grew up on the edge of those same hills, where dust turns to gold at sunset. As a boy, he chased goats through thorn and thistle and learned to read the sky in the flight of birds. His father, a man calloused by years at the plow, spoke to him of covenant and pact, of keeping vows and paying vows with meat and wine. The senses of that childhood were simple and fierce. He remembered the roughness of the threshing floor under his feet, the smoke from a hearth that smelled of rosemary, and the coolness of a spring where he first knelt to pray and feel a presence larger than worry. In youth, he apprenticed to a merchant, learning the weight of silver, the cadence of contracts, the firmness of a handshake sealed before witnesses. Then came a turning marked by loss. His beloved sister died in a plague that moved like a shadow across a city, and he learned the taste of unanswered why. That loss shaped him more than any acquisition. He vowed to intercede daily for those he loved, as if prayer could stand like a guard between life and calamity. Later he married, and his home became a place where hospitality and ritual met. Bread was broken with thanksgiving, and at night he taught his children to name the Lord and to listen for mercy. Now he was older, full of years and gray, a man whose hands bore the map of honest labor. Presently he was a steward of much, not in arrogance, but in stewardship. He kept his wealth with a tenderness, attentive always to the fragile balance between blessing and boast. On a day that opened like any other, messengers came one after another. The first arrived with eyes wild and cloak torn, voice like gravel. He said the raiders had taken the camels and that a fire had leaped through the field where servants were gathered. The second staggered in with horse prints still on his sandals, and spoke of a band of marauders who had carried off silver and took the sons as spoil. The third came with ash on his hair and fingers that could not hold a cup. He said the house collapsed under wind, and that no one who slept in it remained. The rhythm of those arrivals was like a drum that would not stop. Each messenger spoke in a different cadence, and each image etched into the air something more terrible. They smelled of smoke and sweat, of fear and pressed leather. The man tore his robe and sat in dust, his breath a heavy thing in the hush. Yet in the center of that ruin he bowed his head, covered his face, and worshipped. He said with a voice broken and clear the ancient line, "God gave, and God has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." That response stunned those who watched. The community around him murmured. Some were moved to awe. Others could not reconcile his adoration with his loss. Not long after, the material losses came a fever that crept like iron into his skin. It began as small pustules, terrible and burning, that turned his limbs into maps of pain. The smell of medicinal herbs filled the house in the attempt to soothe him, and yet each salve tasted of salt and bitter root. He sat among ashes and scratched until blood had mixed with dust. Neighbors who once knelt at his table now stood at a distance, afraid of contagion and whispering about sin. His wife watched the changes in him as if a chisel were carving his identity away. She pressed her grief into complaint and urged him to renounce reverence for a God who seemed to have joined the adversary in torment. In a moment of fierce honesty, she managed a sentence that cut like flint. "Are you still holding your integrity to the Lord? What did it profit you to fear God?" She wanted him to curse and release the weight of what had been inflicted. He turned his face away and answered with restraint. "First, you speak like a fool. Shall we accept good from God and not adversity?" Through pain he chose a line of worship. Word spread and friends came. Eliphaz the Temanite arrived with a voice of comfort that soon hardened into counsel. Bildad the Shuhite and Zophar the Naamathite came with similar confidence in received wisdom. They approached with the odor of long journeys about them and garments that carried dust like testimony. The first 7 days they sat in silence, a company of mourners surrounding a man whose body bore marks of trial, yet whose spirit would not fall into profanity. Their silence was thick with oil light and breath. Then they spoke. Their dialogues were long and urgent, each exchange a probe of motive and meaning. Eliphaz said, "You have sown error and reaped trouble. You are not blameless." Bildad replied, "Think of your children. Did they not sin?" Zophar demanded, "Confess and find mercy." The man answered with questions and lament. "How can I find words in this silence? Is God distant or just hidden?" They argued, each phrase like a flint to make sparks. Their theology was neat and transactional. Suffering is punishment, confession is remedy. But the man could not accept that his pain was simply payback. He recounted his deeds and his care for the poor. He spoke of his routine of intercession as a safeguard, and his words were both plea and accusation. "I am not guilty. Why does the righteous fall?" He asked them to hear testimonies of his life, to remember the days when his table was open and his hands gave to the stranger. The friends answered by repeating tradition, by appealing to the moral ledger. The air in the room tasted of incense and bitterness. Outside, children skipped and a dog barked, mundane sounds that felt obscene in the face of such debate. Their exchanges stretched into long nights, with 10 or more turns each scene, subtexts layering like sediment. Eliphaz leaned forward and recalled a dream where a spirit warned him of transgression. Bildad summoned ancestral wisdom like a law book. Zophar accused with a voice that trembled between anger and fear. Each dialogue was full and exhausting, 6 senses engaged in each scene: visual, auditory, olfactory, tactile, gustatory, and a sense of inner trembling. As the arguments went on, new voices joined the chorus. A young man named Elihu arrived later, with eyes bright and breath that smelled of the road. He withheld judgment against the older men, yet his words cut differently. He praised God and criticized the friends for presuming to instruct the Almighty. His speech was eloquent and raw. He spoke of divine pedagogy, of the way God uses suffering to instruct and refine. Elihu accused both the man and his friends of speaking without knowledge. He invoked the thunder of heaven and the order of the cosmos to assert that God's ways are beyond human ledger. This accumulation of voices tightened the knot of tension until truth felt like a thing compressed between stones. In the midst of this rising debate, the man alternated between complaint and declaration. He asked how a just God could allow seeming injustice. He yearned for a from the throne, and then the world changed its scale. Out of an old storm a voice came, not a whisper, but a whirlwind that grew like a chorus from far away, and yet intimate and close. The ground under them seemed to catch its breath. The voice addressed not the men with proofs, but the created order. Remember who laid the foundations of the earth, who set the bounds of the sea. Have you commanded the morning? When God spoke, the sky parted like a book, and questions fell like hail. What follows are not answers in the sense of argument, but a litany of wonders the Lord has made. He described the behemoth in his habitat, strength in his loins, and power in the muscles of his belly. He described Leviathan, the twisting sea monster with scales like shields and a breath that kindles coals. The imagery was thunderous and sensory. The smell of salt and deep water rose, the taste of iron in the mouth, the sight of waves that do not yield, the creak of massive limbs. He catalogued stars and constellations, the prey that hunts and the prey that flees, the morning that is called forth, and the gates of death that keep silence. The man listened, speechless and small. His knowledge was parried by the enormity of the creation, and the voice led him from complaint to awe. Consider now the works of the Lord, and be blameless in your ways. The man's posture changed from disputant to pupil. He admitted, I know that you can do all things. I spoke of things I did not understand. He recognized his limitations and answered with a language of surrender. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. In that tourmaline of sound and image, the scale of human certainties was rinsed clean. After the divine speech, the Lord turned attention to the friends and their presumption. The Lord said to them that they had not spoken rightly of what is right, and required that they present an offering, and that the man would intercede for them. In public ritual, they offered sacrifices, and the man prayed on their behalf. He prayed earnestly, and the Lord accepted his intercession, vindicating him in a way that went beyond mere words. The community watched as his fortunes were restored. Twice as many animals and possessions were given to him as before. His family was multiplied, and he lived to see his children and grandchildren gather and bless his days. The restoration carried sensory moments of its own. The air of his house again smelled of fresh bread. Music returned to his courtyard. The swell of gratitude in his chest felt like warm sun on a winter day. The story closed with a ritual of blessing and a justice that quieted the gossip. In the middle of this journey, about a third of the way through the telling, I want to invite you to reflect and to respond. If this account has moved you in some way, pause a moment and write in the comments how you think you would respond in the face of sudden loss. Start your line with, "If it were me," and then be honest. Would you turn to worship? Would you question? Would you run? The community here is a place to share and to glean consolation from other stories. Many of our episodes arise from comments such as yours, and we read them with care. Now return with me as we continue to trace the tension and the theology that this story lays bare. There are several moments that climb like peaks in this narrative, and each carries its own gravity. The first moment is the arrival of the messengers. The shock of one after another tested the rhythm of life and lodged an image of calamity deep in the communal memory. The second moment is the sickness and public ostracism. The sight of a decorated man covered in sores, the sound of neighbors closing doors, the smell of medicinal salves, the texture of ash on skin, all conspired to humiliate and to isolate. The third moment is the friends' long debate. Each speech was a pressure that forced the man to examine his faith while also exposing the limits of human theology. The fourth moment is Elihu's intervention, which introduced a different angle about the purpose of suffering. The fifth moment was the voice out of the whirlwind, which dissolved human presumption into reverent silence. Each of these moments lasted like a paragraph of life, and in each, the inner decision of the man turned on questions of trust and language. Alongside the narrative, we must account for some technical procedures that shaped the religious life of that time. Sacrificial practice followed set steps. The offerer would wash, present animal without blemish, lay hands on the head of the offering, and then the priest would slay and burn portions as a holocaust while reciting prescribed formulas. Intercessory prayer often occurred beside an altar, where incense might be kindled and anointing oil applied. These ritual processes carried weight as embodiments of covenant, and at times functioned as public seals for repentance and reconciliation. They followed a cadence of liturgy that anchored community practice. As the story finds its resolution, there is a theological fold that needs emphasis. Why did God allow the test? What did it prove about the man and about God? The narrative resists simple answers. It resists the neat ledger that equates suffering with guilt. Instead, it reveals a God who is sovereign and whose ways teach beyond reward and punishment. The man's refusal to curse the name of the Lord and his willingness to intercede for those who judged him lift themes of humility, intercession, and restoration. In the end, God's justice was not vindictive, but restorative. The man interceded and was restored materially and relationally. He was declared righteous in a court larger than human accusation. 1 month later, the village had not quite returned to ordinary cadence, but the man walked more slowly in the fields, tasting the newness of survival. The children played with new animals, and friends began to sit again at his table. He found his prayer life altered by a new tenderness. He no longer prayed with the same liturgical certainty. He prayed with hands that trembled, sometimes with gratitude, and sometimes with fear. He kept a corner of his house where he would place a cup of water and a loaf as a memorial to the losses. The community spoke of him with renewed respect and with a softened curiosity. Some came to him for counsel because his sorrow had become a gateway to compassion. He himself would sometimes weep at dusk and then stand to bless the Lord out loud. Those nights smelled of cool earth and baking bread and the sound of a distant shepherd whistle. The visible restoration had not erased memory, and memory had become a teacher. 3 months later, a broader reconciliation had taken shape. The friends who had accused or who had spoken too swiftly sought his presence. They offered apologies that were awkward and fragrant with relief. He accepted them, and in public the community observed a feast in which the poor and the healed were invited to sit first. At that meal, he taught his children to repeat the phrases of faith that had sustained him, and to remember the faces of those who had not stood by him. This ritual of memory was done with oil and with music. The songs were low and the cadence deliberate. The theological residue of the debates remained, but the heat had cooled, and the men who had spoken boldly now spoke with more humility. The town merchants recorded in their ledgers less about accounts and more about names of those who needed support. 6 months on, the restoration had settled into daily life and ripened into a kind of legacy. He had more animals and twice the number of servants, but what he treasured most was the sense of a new covenant in his house. He took time to mentor young men and women, teaching them the skills of commerce and of prayer. He showed them how to bring a sacrifice and how to intercede for others. He recounted the story in quiet ways and encouraged a theology of presence over explanation. He would say that sometimes the Lord's voice comes not as an answer, but as a call to trust. He discouraged easy judgment and urged compassion for those in pain. His days passed with the smell of spices again in his home and the sound of laughter that had returned to his courtyard. We close with the spiritual frame. Every believer meets seasons of loss and unanswered questions, and in those times the story offers one abiding lesson. The measure of faith is not the amount of reward received, but the disposition of the heart toward the Lord in absence of explanation. We learn that suffering is not always a sentence of guilt, and that intercession can be the instrument of reconciliation even with those who have misjudged us. The man who entered the time of trial wearing integrity came out with a broader compassion and a restored life. The Lord's response did not feel like a simple verdict, but like a reclaiming and a renewal. If this account touched you, please share in the comments with the phrase, "If it were me," and then name the response you imagine. Would you worship? Would you doubt? Would you intercede? Your words can bring comfort and prompt helpful conversation. If you value this kind of careful storytelling and theological reflection, subscribe to the channel for more episodes that examine lives from the Scriptures in historical color and devotional depth. We aim to bring context, research, and pastoral care to each story. Remember the phrase that anchors the man in the midst of loss: God gave, and God has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Let that line not be empty ritual, but a posture that trusts the Lord in the mystery of providence. In the silence of unanswered questions, you may not always receive reasons, but you may receive presence. The real secret this story reveals is not a trick or a hidden formula, but the witness that faith can hold both lament and worship at once. And in that holding, there is a deep restoration that no tally of goods can measure.